Have you ever had to pretend to love someone just to survive the expectations of others? What if, in a world where appearances meant everything, you were forced to choose between being true to yourself or playing a perfect role in someone else's story? Alexander Blake Whitmore, a powerful CEO burdened by legacy and loneliness, hired a woman he barely knew to pose as his fiancée for one elite night. Grace Evelyn Monroe, a quiet bookstore owner fighting to save her father's shop, accepted the offer for reasons of her own. They were never meant to matter to each other. But what happens when a lie begins to feel like the only truth you've ever known? If you were in their place, would you walk away when your heart finally starts to speak? Or would you stay and risk everything just for something real? Tonight, we invite you into a story of quiet choices, unexpected love, and the moment when pretending becomes impossible. If this story touches something in you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let's begin. The room fell quiet, not abruptly, but in that subtle way where conversations dim and eyes begin to shift. In a hall, glittering with crystal chandeliers and $1,000 tuxedos, silence itself became a kind of applause. She stood just beyond the doors of the grand ballroom, framed by the soft gold light spilling in from the hallway. Grace Evelyn Monroe, in a deep emerald dress that moved like water with each step. She wasn't the most glamorous woman there, but somehow she was the one no one could look away from. Alexander Blake. Witmore froze mid-conversation. His hand still rested lightly on the edge of a champagne flute, the bubbles frozen in time like everything else around him. This wasn't what he expected. This wasn't the woman he had hired. Or rather it was, but not the way he remembered her. The Grace Monroe he met 2 weeks ago had worn corduroy and smelled faintly of old paper and cedar wood. Her hair was pinned back in a plain clip. She spoke softly, almost apologetically, with a quiet intensity that made him think of libraries and autumn rain. The Grace standing before him now had her chin slightly lifted, her gaze calm, intelligent, unwavering. She wasn't flashy, but she had gravity, like someone who didn't need to prove she belonged. And suddenly, Alexander realized, the plan was already unraveling. 2 weeks earlier, that plan had felt airtight. His mother, Caroline Witmore, had summoned him, more like cornered him in the sunroom of their Boston estate. The Witmore annual gala was coming up, and the family name demanded more than just another year of bachelorhood gossip. "You're 45, she said, sipping her tea with surgical precision. You run one of the most powerful real estate companies on the East Coast. It's time people see stability. It's time you present someone." Alexander had stood by the fireplace, hands in his pockets, a muscle in his jaw ticking. He loved his mother, but she spoke of love like a merger, a matter of good timing and better genes. She mentioned Vivian Langley, again, the daughter of a senator, Ivy League educated, well-mannered, well-dressed, well, perfect on paper. Alexander had known Vivian in college. She liked attention and luxury, and he suspected she liked his last name even more than she liked him. So he nodded that day to quiet his mother's expectations, but in private, he called an agency that specialized in unique solutions for high-profile clients. Discretion was their currency. He didn't need love. He needed someone who could play the part. A simple deal one weekend, one event, one fabricated fiancé. He had specified clearly someone calm, forgettable, capable of polite conversation and blending into a crowd. No risks, no stunts. Just a clean, quiet performance to appease the board, the press, and most of all, his mother. They had sent 3 profiles. He chose Grace because she had kind eyes and a resume that said used bookstore owner instead of actress or influencer. She looked like she read poetry in her free time and wouldn't attract headlines. They met once in a rented office near Providence. She was on time, soft-spoken, and asked thoughtful questions. She even took notes. There was something steady about her presence, like a lighthouse on a foggy coast. Perfect, unremarkable, safe. But tonight, Grace Monroe wasn't safe. She wasn't forgettable. She had walked into the room like a quiet flame, drawing people not by force, but by nature. And Caroline Witmore was already walking toward her. Alexander moved fast, reaching Grace just as his mother did. His voice dropped to a hush. "You're early." She smiled up at him, calm, composed. "Is that a problem?" He opened his mouth, but Caroline's voice cut in like a violin string pulled taut. And this must be. Grace turned smoothly and extended her hand. "Grace Monroe," she said. "It's a pleasure to meet you. Mrs. Whitmore. Alexander's told me such wonderful things." It was a lie, of course. They had barely rehearsed that line. But she delivered it, like truth, graceful, measured, with a tone of gentle warmth that caught Caroline slightly off guard. "I see," Caroline said slowly, eyes scanning Grace's dress, her posture, her smile. There was no panic in her gaze, just calculation, a silent measuring of worth. "And where exactly did you 2 meet again in Vermont?" Grace replied, without missing a beat. "A bookstore in a small town just outside Brattleboro. He was lost. I gave him directions, and we kept running into each other after that." A small laugh, a tilt of the head. Alexander blinked. That was not in the script. But Caroline chuckled faintly. "Well, isn't that quaint?" She moved on, offering a half nod before gliding away. Alexander turned to Grace, still stunned. "Where did that come from?" Grace's eyes twinkled. "I used to live in Brattleboro. You said to make it sound believable?" He stared at her. Something shifted. For the first time, he saw not just a partner in a deal, but a woman with her own stories, her own edges and colors, and somewhere deep inside him, something fragile and quiet. Started to lean in, long before she stepped into that ballroom, before the soft green silk hugged her waist and her eyes met the astonished stares of strangers. Grace Evelyn Monroe was simply trying to keep her bookstore alive. Label and Leaf sat quietly on a narrow street in Providence. Rhode Island, its wooden sign faded. The bell above the door soft and comforting, in a way that reminded people of home. Inside, the air always smelled of old paper, ground cinnamon, and cedar oil. Grace's own blend meant to soothe. She never planned on taking a job like this. Pretending to be someone's fiancé for the sake of a high society gala wasn't exactly on her bucket list. But reality doesn't ask for permission before it shifts under your feet. The bookstore had been her father's dream, passed to her after he passed away 5 years ago. It had never made much profit, but it had always made enough until this past winter. Rent had gone up. Fewer people were buying books. She was behind on payments, and her landlord had left a letter that morning with a red notice tucked under the door. 2 months. That's what she had left. When the agency called offering $30,000 for one weekend, no strings, no press, it felt surreal. She didn't even remember applying. Apparently, someone had referred her, a college friend. Maybe she wasn't sure, but the conditions were clear, the confidentiality airtight, and the compensation life-saving. She hesitated. Of course, she wasn't a liar, but she wasn't foolish either. That night, she sat alone on the floor of her store, a cup of chamomile cooling in her hand, staring at the eviction letter and the crumpled proposal from Witmore Enterprises. Her thumb traced the paper's edges. "If this keeps the lights on," she whispered to the books around her, "maybe it's worth pretending for one night." The first time she met Alexander Blake Whitmore. It was raining. Not a dramatic storm, just a steady, persistent spring rain that darkened the windows and brought the scent of wet pavement into the rented agency office. He arrived precisely on time, in a charcoal gray suit with a silver tie, not a hair out of place. Grace had worn a navy cardigan, a simple dress, and no makeup. She didn't think it mattered. He shook her hand, glanced once at the folder in front of him, then asked in a tone more professional than personal, "You understand what's required?" She nodded. "You'll be introduced as my fiancé. Our backstory is simple. We met in Vermont, kept our relationship private. Just smile, be polite, don't contradict me, and don't draw attention." She had raised an eyebrow. "So, you want a shadow?" He looked at her, then, truly looked for half a second. "I want someone who won't be remembered." The words hung in the air like fog. Grace didn't reply. She just nodded again, her eyes steady. They went over the details, Caroline Whitmore's preferences, key family members, topics to avoid, attire recommendations. The tone was strictly transactional. Grace took notes, asked a few questions, and left with a small folder and a blank expression. What Alexander didn't notice, what he couldn't have known, was how carefully Grace prepared afterward. She didn't just memorize names. She read about the Whitmore Foundation, studied the architectural designs of their properties, and even learned the preferred wine of Lady Caroline from an old interview. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about not being humiliated. Grace didn't want to stand in that ballroom and feel like a fraud. Even if it was pretend, she wanted to hold her head high, not for them, but for herself. So she practiced the smile. She bought the dress not rented, bought at a vintage boutique owned by a friend who owed her a favor. She had it altered by hand, choosing the emerald color not because it was trendy, but because it reminded her of moss-covered trails after rain. And when the day finally came, she took the bus to Boston, checked into the suite arranged for her, and spent 3 hours preparing not to become someone else, but to make sure they saw her as more than a footnote, not a shadow, not someone forgettable. She knew what people like Alexander thought of women like her: practical, quiet, ordinary. Grace had no illusions about changing the world in one night, but if she was going to walk into that room, she would do it with her spine straight and her eyes open. She wasn't hired to matter, but that didn't mean she had to disappear. Back at the ballroom, after the introductions, after the practiced smiles and the unexpected eye contact that lingered a moment too long, Grace found herself momentarily alone by the edge of the room. A waiter passed. She took a flute of sparkling water and exhaled slowly, letting the coolness of the glass ground her. Alexander approached. "You handled that well," he said quietly. Grace didn't look at him. "Handled what, my mother? She's particular." Grace let out a soft hum. "She's sharp. Reminds me of a librarian I once worked for. You could never lie to her either?" He gave a slight smile, more from the corners of his eyes than his mouth. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Around them, the gala carried on laughter, champagne, footsteps echoing off marble. Then Alexander said, "You look different." Grace turned to him. "I'm not—" And just like that, he realized he hadn't actually seen her before. He had looked, but he hadn't seen. There are moments in life that shift everything like a soft breeze, strong enough to alter a falling leaf's path. Grace Evelyn Monroe's entrance into the Witmore Foundation Gala was one such moment. The Waldorf Grand in Boston had hosted senators, celebrities, and foreign dignitaries, but rarely had it fallen into such a collective hush. Not for a scandal, not for a political announcement, but for her. It wasn't the dress, though the emerald silk traced her silhouette like a whispered poem. It wasn't the jewelry, there were none, save for a modest antique locket tucked just beneath her collarbone. It was the way she stood, still, poised, present. It was the way she looked at people straight in the eyes, like she wasn't impressed, wasn't intimidated, wasn't looking for approval, just quietly measuring the world and deciding what was worth her time. Alexander Blake Whitmore had seen enough polished women in designer gowns to become immune. But as he watched Grace move, unhurried and sure, something fragile cracked in his carefully constructed calm. She was supposed to be a backdrop, a gentle presence beside him. Instead, she was becoming the center of gravity. Carolyn Whitmore noticed too. From her vantage point near the chandeliered reception line, the matriarch narrowed her eyes just slightly. It was not a look of disdain, but curiosity. She had expected a simple girl, someone pretty but forgettable, someone obedient. What she saw was elegance not bought, but lived. Grace wore the kind of confidence you didn't learn at a debutante ball. It was quieter than power, deeper than charm. It was presence. "Who is she?" a voice whispered behind Caroline. "Alexander's fiancée," another replied, skeptical. "They say they've been dating in secret," or invented a third added with a smirk. Caroline said nothing. She adjusted the pearl clasp at her throat, eyes following Grace's every move. Vivian Langley, standing near the champagne fountain, watched with thinly veiled disdain. Her gown shimmered with carefully arranged diamonds, her laugh just a little too loud. She had been raised in these rooms. She knew the rules. Beauty mattered, but bloodlines mattered more. Charm was currency, but only when wielded like a blade. And Grace was an outsider. Worse, she was captivating. Vivian's mother leaned in. She doesn't look like much on paper, but she's drawing eyes. Too many? Vivian's smile was tight. Let's see how she holds up in conversation. Meanwhile, Grace had begun moving through the room, each step steady as if she belonged. She exchanged greetings, deflected questions with ease, and somehow made small talk feel genuine. Alexander stayed close not because he had to, but because he wanted to. There was a rhythm to how she navigated people, like she was dancing through a maze of expectations and doing it with grace. No pun intended. At one point, Lady Evelyn Chamberlain, a woman known for crushing egos with a single glance, asked Grace where she purchased her gown. "It's vintage," Grace replied. "I found it in a boutique run by a woman who sells dresses by story, not by label." The dowager blinked, then smiled, a rare occurrence. "Stories last longer than seasons," she said. "Smart choice." Later in the evening, as the charity auction began and chatter softened, Alexander led Grace to a quieter corner of the balcony overlooking the garden courtyard. "You're making an impression," he said. Grace leaned on the stone railing, letting the cool air settle her. "That wasn't the job description, was it?" Alexander chuckled low, reluctant. "No. You were supposed to blend in. Be safe." Grace turned to him. "Is that what you look for in people's safety?" He looked at her. Really looked. "I used to." A pause settled between them. Not uncomfortable, just full. Like the space between raindrops when the storm is deciding whether to pass or stay. Then came the voice neither of them wanted to hear. "Well, well, isn't this charming, Vivian?" She approached. "Smile like satin soaked in vinegar." "Alexander, darling, aren't you going to introduce me to your companion?" Grace extended her hand calmly. "Grace Monroe." Vivian took it briefly, then turned her gaze toward Alexander. "I must say, this is a surprise. I thought I knew your type better." Grace smiled, not sweetly, but slowly. "Types are boring. Don't you think they're just patterns people repeat when they haven't figured themselves out?" Vivian blinked. Alexander bit back a grin. "Well," Vivian said, voice clipped, "I suppose some enjoy being unpredictable." "I suppose," Grace replied softly. "Some just pretend they are." Vivian's heels clicked away, each step sharp with unsaid fury. Alexander exhaled a quiet laugh. That wasn't in the script either. Grace turned back to the garden view. Maybe we should stop reading from the script. That night, as the orchestra played and stars began to shimmer above the glass dome, Grace danced, not just with Alexander, but with donors, with foundation heads, with women who had forgotten how to enjoy a night instead of compete in it, and slowly. The room shifted again, not because Grace demanded it, but because she invited it. Alexander, watching from the side, realized something else. This wasn't about pretending anymore. Not for her, and maybe not for him either. The piano music drifted through the ballroom like candle smoke, slow, lingering, elegant. Grace Evelyn Monroe stood near the ornate display of auction items, her fingers gently tracing the frame of a sepia-toned photo of Boston Harbor from the 1920s. She wasn't speaking. She wasn't smiling. She was just still. And yet people kept glancing toward her as if she were holding a conversation with the air itself. Alexander Blake Witmore had been watching from a few feet away, caught in the unfamiliar grip of curiosity, the kind that gnawed at the edges of routine and told him something didn't add up. This was supposed to be a performance, a role, rehearsed and contained. But Grace wasn't just playing along anymore. She was becoming something else, someone else, or maybe she was simply becoming more of herself. They sat down for dinner an hour later, 8 guests per table, every seat filled with a name that could fund a museum wing. Grace was seated between Alexander and Lady Evelyn Chamberlain, who had taken a fond interest in her after their earlier exchange. Conversation flowed real estate projections, foundation updates, art auctions. Grace listened more than she spoke, but when she did speak, it mattered. I read recently, she said, that the most visited section of any public library isn't the bestseller shelf. It's local history. The man across from her blinked. Really why she smiled, because people want to feel rooted, especially when the world moves too fast. We're all looking for something that reminds us we belong somewhere. There was a pause long enough to feel, and then several nods. Even Carolyn Whitmore, seated nearby, gave an almost imperceptible glance her way. Alexander sat quietly, fork poised midair. That line wasn't in the script either. Later that night, they found themselves alone briefly in the reception hallway. The music muffled behind heavy oak doors, the corridor lined with soft lamps and old portraits of benefactors past. "You're not just pretending," Alexander said. It wasn't an accusation, more of a realization. Grace looked at him, eyes calm. Would it be better if I was... He didn't answer. She stepped closer, not too close, and leaned against the window ledge. "You asked for someone who wouldn't draw attention, who'd blend in, but you never asked who I was." Alexander shifted his weight. "I thought I didn't need to." Grace nodded slowly. "That's what I figured." She turned, folding her arms. "You know what's strange? I've never been in a room like that before. I've never worn a dress like this, never had people look at me like I mattered, and yet I've never felt more myself." The hallway grew quiet again. He looked at her silhouette against the glass, strong, graceful, real. "Why did you agree to this?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was soft. "Because I needed the money. But also, maybe because I wanted to prove something to myself." He studied her. "Prove what? That I could step into a world that wasn't built for me and not lose who I am." She didn't look at him as she said it, and he didn't look away. Back inside, the auction continued. Vivian Langley made sure to corner Alexander at the wine table. "She's impressive," she said, feigning indifference, "but she doesn't belong here." He raised an eyebrow. "Who decides that?" Vivian smiled. "Oh, darling, you and I both know this world doesn't run on kindness and clever bookstore metaphors. It runs on pedigree, alliances, legacy." She sipped her wine. "Your mother is watching. So are your investors. Don't get distracted." Alexander leaned in just enough. Maybe they should be watching Grace. Vivian blinked, then laughed too loudly. Back at the table, Grace was speaking with James Loring, a developer who held more real estate in Boston than the state itself. They were discussing preservation of old libraries, historical homes, fading neighborhoods. Alexander watched as James nodded, genuinely interested. Then Grace said something that made him pause. "It's easy to build something tall, harder to build something that lasts." The words hit Alexander like a gust of winter wind, sharp, sudden, personal. She wasn't just talking about buildings. She was talking about life, about him. Later that night, during a brief moment between dances, Carolyn Whitmore approached her son. "She's different," she said, almost thoughtfully. Alexander looked at his mother, surprised. Different. How Caroline's eyes flicked toward Grace across the room. "She's not what I expected, but there's steel under all that softness. Then she added, after a pause, "Where did you find her?" Alexander hesitated. He didn't want to lie, but the truth felt too complicated. "In Vermont," he said. Caroline nodded once. "She reminds me of your father's mother. Quiet, but never small." Then she walked away, leaving Alexander standing in a strange, swelling silence. The rest of the evening blurred into warm lighting, soft music, and clinking glasses. When it was finally time to leave, Alexander offered Grace his arm. She took it gently. Neither of them said much on the way to the car. The driver opened the door. Alexander turned to Grace, his voice low. "You were remarkable tonight." Grace smiled. "That wasn't the job. Remember, he opened the door for her." She hesitated. "Alex, why me?" The question hung there, honest and unafraid. He looked at her. "Really looked, because I thought you wouldn't matter." Then, with a shake of his head, "But you do." And for the first time since the night began, Grace looked shaken, not by the attention, but by the truth. The ballroom had thinned. The auction was over. The speeches had been made. The toasts had clinked against crystal glassware under chandeliers that looked like frozen rain. And yet Grace Evelyn Monroe still felt suspended somewhere between two lives. She stood beside Alexander near the edge of the grand dance floor. Soft violin music hummed from the live quartet, and the lighting had shifted, warmer now, casting golden tones over polished floors and faces flushed with wine. They were supposed to dance. That had been part of the plan. One dance, close enough for photos, scripted enough to seem real. Grace looked at Alexander. He was silent, adjusting his cuff as if it mattered. But something in his posture, just a slight lean toward her, a stillness in his shoulders, told her he was stalling. Not out of fear, but hesitation. The kind you feel when a door creaks open you weren't sure you wanted to walk through. "Are we doing this?" she asked, voice barely above the music. He looked up, startled, then nodded once. They stepped onto the floor. At first, it was mechanical, one hand on her back, the other in hers. The required space between them, formal, perfect, empty. But the moment the music swelled, something shifted. Grace felt it first, the soft press of his hand, warm and sure. The weight of his attention suddenly, completely on her, not the eyes of the room, not his mother, just her. She moved, and he moved with her, fluid, unthinking. Her heart fluttered at the realization that they were not leading or following. They were simply sinking. Alexander felt it too. Grace wasn't like the women he had danced with before, who were taught to move by steps, not by feel. There was no calculation in her presence, no performance. There was only presence. She smelled faintly of jasmine and old paper, and he found himself breathing more slowly, more deeply, as if trying to memorize it. "Grace," he said softly, unsure why he was saying her name at all. She looked up at him. Yes, but he didn't answer, because what he wanted to say wasn't part of the script, because he didn't know if it was real or just the echo of violins and candlelight and borrowed time. Later, when the dance ended and they returned to their table, Grace noticed something small but telling. Alexander reached for her hand under the table, not because anyone was watching, but because he wanted to. His thumb moved gently along her knuckle, a gesture so tender, so unguarded. She had to look away for a moment to steady herself. And when she glanced up again, she saw Carolyn Witmore watching them from across the room. But this time there was no scrutiny in her gaze, just curiosity and perhaps a glimmer of wonder. The night wore on, and with each passing hour, Grace felt the lines blur further. Alexander wasn't performing anymore. His smiles were no longer rehearsed. His laughter was rare, but real. And the way he looked at her, especially when he thought she wasn't noticing, felt like a question. Neither of them knew how to answer yet. When the final speech was about to begin, his speech, Grace noticed a shift in his posture, a stiffness. He stood beside the podium, his fingers tapping the edge of the marble. The crowd settled. The lights dimmed just slightly. He cleared his throat once, twice. Grace, seated just a few feet away, saw it clearly. He was nervous. The man who'd faced boardrooms, negotiations, hostile takeovers unshaken, was faltering under the weight of a room filled with champagne and expectations. Without thinking, she rose, stepped close, placed a hand gently on his arm. He turned his head. She whispered, so only he could hear, "You've got this. Just be yourself." He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. His eyes said it all. The speech was simple. No grand gestures. Just a man talking about legacy, about community, about what it meant to build things that mattered, not just buildings, but lives. When he said, "Sometimes the most unexpected foundations are the strongest," he didn't look at the crowd. He looked at her, and Grace felt her breath catch, because she knew. He wasn't just thanking donors. He was telling her something. After the speech, after the applause, after the lights dimmed even further, and guests began filtering out, Alexander and Grace stood near the entrance. She had her clutch in one hand, the locket around her neck now visible under the soft folds of her gown. He didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he said, "You were extraordinary tonight." She gave a small smile. "That wasn't the deal." "I know." A beat of silence. Then he added, "This is the part where we say goodbye." "Isn't it?" Grace nodded. "That's how the contract ends." But neither of them moved. Outside, the city pulsed taxis, traffic, distant laughter. But inside, in the stillness of the entryway, everything felt suspended. Alexander looked at her, eyes tired but open. "There's a part of me that wishes we could rewrite it," he said. She met his gaze, rewrite what he hesitated. And then, in a voice softer than she'd ever heard from him, all of it. And, though she didn't answer, Grace felt something shift in her chest, because she wanted that too. But hearts were never part of the deal, and that was what made it dangerous. The car ride was quiet, not the kind of silence that stretched awkwardly between strangers, but the kind that wraps itself around people who have said too much without speaking at all. Grace Evelyn Monroe sat in the passenger seat of the black Bentley, her hands resting lightly in her lap, the night's energy still clinging to her skin like the faint scent of jasmine in her hair. Outside, the lights of Boston flickered by soft, golden blurs of a city moving on, unaware of two people sitting just on the edge of something neither of them had a name for. Alexander Blake. Witmore gripped the steering wheel loosely, his gaze focused ahead, but not entirely present. His tuxedo jacket had been removed, his sleeves rolled up. He looked more human than he had all evening, less composed, more real. They were headed to Grace's apartment. The gala was over. So was the agreement. At least, that's what they told themselves. Inside the car, the silence began to crack, not with words, but with memory. Images flashed behind Grace's eyes like flickering film, the warmth of his hand in hers during the dance, the sincerity in his voice when he delivered his speech, the moment their eyes met, not for the room, not for the camera, but just for each other. She'd played the role. She'd fulfilled every line of the contract. But somewhere along the way, something honest had taken root in her chest, and now it hurt, just a little, just enough. Alexander cleared his throat. "You really did save me tonight," he said, his voice low, a little rough. Grace smiled faintly. "You weren't in danger." He glanced over at her. "You don't know my mother?" She chuckled softly. "She's sharp, but she saw you tonight. Not the heir, not the CEO, just you." He was quiet for a moment. "Then that was because of you." The car turned onto a quieter street. Old brick buildings lined the sidewalks, their windows glowing dimly like sleeping houses in storybooks. He slowed near the corner, pulling up in front of a modest apartment above a shop with an old wooden sign that read, "Label and Leaf Books." Grace looked out the window. Home. The place she'd built with her hands, her late father's shelves, and years of quiet hope. It suddenly felt far away from the ballroom, from chandeliers and champagne and whispered intrigue, yet, somehow, more real than anything else. Alexander turned off the engine, but didn't move. He looked at her. "You surprised me." Grace met his eyes, because I wasn't forgettable. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes, because you reminded me that not everything valuable makes noise. They sat like that for another beat, the air between them full of unspoken things. Then Grace unbuckled her seatbelt. "Well," she said quietly, "I guess this is where we go back to our own lives." He nodded slowly. "Right." She reached for the door handle, paused, and turned back. "You know," she said, voice gentle, "when you first walked into that office, I thought you were just another rich man trying to buy an illusion." He smiled softly. "Was I wrong?" She looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said, "but I think you weren't just that." A silence fell again, this one heavier, and then she opened the door. Grace stepped out into the cool night, her heels clicking softly on the sidewalk. She turned once, lifted a hand in farewell, and walked toward the narrow door of her apartment. Alexander watched her until she disappeared inside, and then he sat there, not moving, not ready to drive away. The city hummed quietly around him, but inside the car, the air was still. For a man who had built his life around clear decisions, numbers, risk mitigation, this was unfamiliar territory. He didn't know how to plan for a feeling, didn't know how to measure the weight of what if. Upstairs, Grace leaned against the closed door, her hand still resting on the knob. She could still feel the warmth of his touch on her back during the dance, still hear his voice measured, sincere, unscripted. She had gone into this with her eyes wide open, for money, for survival, and yet here she was, chest tight, eyes stinging, because something about him had felt kind and rare and unfinished. She crossed to the bookshelf by the window and pulled out a worn paperback, a movable feast. Tucked inside was the folded contract. She looked at it, then, slowly, tore it in half, not out of spite, but because Something had shifted, even if nothing came of it, even if he never came back. She wanted to mark this not as a performance, but as a memory, something real, in the Bentley. Alexander finally leaned back, closed his eyes, and whispered to the empty car. Goodbye was never supposed to be the hardest line, but it was. Because some stories don't end when the page turns. They linger, they wait, they hope. 3 days had passed since the gala, 3 long, uneven days where everything looked the same, but nothing felt quite right. For Alexander Blake Whitmore, the days were filled with meetings, emails, investor calls. He moved through them like muscle memory, nodding in all the right places, speaking in his usual even tone. But underneath the surface, something churned. He hadn't called Grace. He hadn't gone back to her bookstore, and yet, in quiet moments, when his office emptied, when the city lights blinked outside his window like distant thoughts, she was there, not in photographs or videos, but in the soft weight of memory, in the words she had whispered before his speech, in the way her hand had found his under the table. Not for show, but because she cared, because somehow, along the line of pretending, something real had slipped through. He stood in his private office on the top floor of Witmore Tower, looking down over the Boston skyline, a glass of scotch in his hand, untouched. The door opened behind him. "I was expecting you," he said, without turning. Caroline Witmore stepped inside, elegant as ever in slate gray and pearls. Her heels barely made a sound against the marble floor. "So," she said, settling into a leather chair, "are you going to tell me who she really is?" Alexander turned slowly. "Excuse me." Caroline folded her hands. "Grace, the woman who walked into that gala and charmed half the room, including, surprisingly, myself." Alexander said nothing. Caroline leaned forward slightly. "I may be old-fashioned, Alexander, but I'm not blind. That wasn't your fiancé, at least not in any legal or lived sense." Still, he stayed silent. She exhaled. What surprised me most wasn't that she was pretending, it was how little it felt like a performance. That made him look up. "She meant it," Caroline said, softer now, every smile, every word. That was a woman trying her best not to show how much she cared. Alexander's voice, when it came, was quieter than he expected. She wasn't supposed to matter, but she did, Caroline said. Didn't she? He sat down across from his mother, the silence in the room thick as wool. "I hired her," he admitted finally, "through an agency. One night, one event. That was the deal." Caroline nodded, not surprised, but somewhere in the middle of it. He continued. She stopped being part of the plan. A long pause. Then Caroline said, "I saw it in your eyes when you danced with her. You looked like your father." Alexander glanced up. "He never loved the spotlight either," she said. "But when he looked at me, during our first ball together, there was something no camera could catch." She smiled, faintly. "I saw that in you." Alexander set the glass down. "I don't know what to do." Caroline stood. "Then I'll give you the advice my mother gave me the day I almost married the wrong man." She walked toward the door, pausing with her hand on the knob. "If something feels more real than anything else in your life, don't waste time asking if it's supposed to. Just go find it." And with that, she was gone. Grace Evelyn Monroe didn't expect the knock on her shop door. It was late afternoon. Rain tapped gently against the windows, and the smell of wet leaves drifted in through a small crack in the old frame. She had been rearranging a shelf in the back, trying to pretend the last 3 days hadn't left her hollow. She hadn't expected anything. Not a phone call, not a message, certainly not him. But there he was, standing just beyond the glass. No suit, no tie, just a navy wool coat, damp at the shoulders, his hair slightly tousled, his eyes tired, open. She unlocked the door slowly. "Hi," he said. Grace blinked. "You came all the way from Boston." He nodded. "It was either that or lose sleep for the next 6 months." She stepped aside. He entered. The shop smelled like cedar and paper and time, just like he remembered. They stood near the fiction aisle, awkward again, like strangers. "I thought I could leave it behind," Alexander said finally. "Tell myself it was a contract, a role, a favor exchanged." But Grace asked, barely above a whisper, "But the way you looked at me when I forgot my speech, that wasn't acting." She looked at the floor. "And when I danced with you," he continued, "I stopped counting steps. I stopped thinking." Grace didn't speak. So he added, "I'm not asking for a second performance. I'm asking for something real, whatever that means, however long it lasts." A long pause. Then she asked, "Are you sure it's not just the moment, the pressure, the guilt?" He stepped closer. "No, I've felt those before. This is different. This is clarity." He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small wrapped bundle. She unfolded it carefully. It was a copy of A Movable Feast. Her copy. He'd gone back to the gala suite, somehow found it. Inside, tucked between the pages, was a note in her handwriting, one she'd scribbled in a moment of doubt before the event. "If I come out of this remembering who I am, I've already won." Grace held it like something fragile, then looked at him. "I'm still Grace?" she whispered. Alexander nodded. "Good, because she's the one I came back for." It didn't happen overnight. Grace Evelyn Monroe didn't wake up the next morning and suddenly fall into Alexander's arms like the final scene of a movie. There were no sweeping violin scores or spontaneous fireworks lighting up the sky above Providence. Instead, it began with something quieter. He stayed, not just in her bookstore that day, but in the days after. He came back each morning, sometimes with coffee, sometimes with nothing but a quiet look that asked, "May I be here?" And she let him. She let him see her in the early hours, hair undone, surrounded by stacks of unsorted books. She let him help repair a creaky shelf in the corner, let him alphabetize a section of biographies, though he complained the whole time that nobody needed 26 books about Eleanor Roosevelt. It was slow, deliberate, tender. One morning, as the first snow dusted the city, Grace poured them both tea from her father's old kettle. Alexander stood by the front window, looking out at the street lamp, casting shadows across the snow-covered sidewalk. "I keep waiting for this to feel unreal," he said. Grace handed him the cup. "Does it?" He looked at her, his eyes soft. "No, it feels more real than anything else I've done in the last 10 years." She smiled into her tea. "Maybe that's what scares us." He nodded. "Because there's no plan for this. No script," she added. "No pretending." Back in Boston, the board of Witmore Enterprises had questions. Alexander answered them all. Yes, The woman at the gala was Grace Monroe. No, she wasn't a debutante or a political match. Yes, they had shared something real. And no, he didn't regret it. Some raised eyebrows, some called it reckless. But one board member, an old friend of his father's, simply said, "Finally, something honest." He didn't need anyone's approval, but that moment stayed with him. It was Caroline Witmore, however, who surprised everyone. At the winter fundraiser luncheon weeks later, she stood beside her son and addressed a crowd of socialites, donors, and press. "I've always believed in legacy," she began, "in heritage, in tradition. But lately, I've come to understand something my late husband always knew." She looked at Alexander, then at Grace. That legacy means nothing without truth, without heart, without the kind of love that endures not because it's expected, but because it chooses to stay. No one in the room said a word, but Grace's hand found Alexander's beneath the table. And held tight. Months passed. Spring thawed the last of winter's stubborn chill, and label and leaf books flourished more than ever. With a little help from a new website, a small infusion of capital, and word-of-mouth buzz from a certain gala story, the store had become a quiet haven for readers, artists, and dreamers. Grace kept her shelves curated by instinct, not algorithms. She still brewed her own cedar jasmine blend. She still wore cardigans and soft scarves and ink on her fingertips from hand-labeling every bookmark. She was still Grace. One Saturday afternoon, Alexander walked in holding a small package. Grace raised an eyebrow. "Another antique." He shook his head. "Not this time." She unwrapped the box carefully. Inside was a set of small, custom-made bookplates. Each one read, "From the library of Grace Evelyn Monroe Witmore." Her breath caught. She looked at him. "That's presumptuous." He smiled. "I know. But also," she added, a little smile tugging at her lips, "very charming." He leaned in. "Are you saying yes to the bookplates, to the name?" She looked at the plate again, ran her finger over the ink, then looked at the man who had walked into her life with a contract and stayed with a heart. "Yes," she said softly. "No more pretending." 1 year later, at the next Witmore Gala, guests arrived expecting another spectacle, and they got one. But it wasn't about scandal or surprise. It was the way Alexander stood beside Grace, not as a man hiding behind expectation, but as a man finally aligned with his own truth. It was the way Grace walked into the room, not to impress, but to be. It was the way they looked at each other quietly, steadily, without needing an audience. Lady Evelyn Chamberlain leaned toward Caroline that evening, sipping champagne. "You were right about her," she said. Caroline smiled. "For once, I'm glad I was." Outside, after the final dance, Grace and Alexander stood under the soft glow of the hotel's portico. Snow was falling again light, slow, silent. Alexander pulled her close. "What now?" she asked, leaning her head against his shoulder. "We build something," he said. "Not tall, just lasting." She looked up at him, eyes shining. Together he nodded. "No scripts, no contracts, just you and me, and under the snowflakes, wrapped in silence and warmth." Grace whispered the only thing left to say, yes. Sometimes the most profound truths about love, identity, and courage don't come through dramatic choices, but through the quiet ones. The decision to show up as yourself. even in a world that rewards masks, the bravery to reach for connection, even when everything seems temporary. Through Alexander and Grace's story, we're reminded that appearances may impress, but it's sincerity that truly endures. For many of us, especially as we grow older, it becomes easier to retreat behind roles we've played for decades: spouse, parent, professional, provider. But this story gently asks what would happen if you dared to choose authenticity. Even just once more, love at any age is still about presence, about choosing someone not because they're perfect, but because they make you feel seen. So whether you're starting over or simply remembering who you are, may this story remind you it's never too late to stop pretending and start living your truth. Thank you so much for spending your time with us and letting this story unfold in your heart. If it touched you in any way, made you feel, remember, or simply pause, we're truly grateful. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you meaningful tales that speak to the soul. Until next time, take care, stay true, and keep believing in the quiet power of love.